May 19, 2023. Lake Meredith, West Texas. A remote reservoir approximately 50 miles north of Amarillo, surrounded by rugged terrain, sparse vegetation, and the kind of isolation that defines the Texas Panhandle. The lake was created in the 1960s, when Sanford Dam was constructed on the Canadian River, flooding valleys and creating a water source for the region's agricultural operations and small towns. In May 2023, Lake Meredith was experiencing conditions it hadn't seen in decades. A severe drought gripping the region had lowered water levels significantly, revealing shoreline that had been submerged for years. Boat ramps that once reached water now extended onto dry, cracked earth. Islands that existed only in historical maps had re-emerged. The drought was devastating for ranchers and farmers who depended on the reservoir, but it created opportunities for underwater exploration that hadn't existed before. A team from Southwest Aquatic Research, a company specializing in underwater sonar mapping and lake surveys, had been contracted to map the lake bottom. Their work served multiple purposes: assessing the reservoir's current capacity, documenting geological features, and creating updated maps for recreational boaters. The team, led by Marcus Webb, had been systematically scanning sections of the lake using advanced side-scan sonar technology that could create detailed images of objects on the lake bottom. On May 19th, while mapping a section near the western shore, approximately 2 miles from the nearest boat ramp, Marcus's sonar equipment detected something unusual. At a depth of approximately 30 feet, in an area where the old riverbed once ran before the dam created the lake, the sonar showed a large metallic object. The shape was distinctive, rectangular with clear geometric lines, definitely man-made, roughly the size of a vehicle. Marcus made note of the coordinates and continued his survey. But the object lingered in his mind. That evening, reviewing the sonar images with his team, he decided it warranted investigation. The next morning, May 20th, Marcus returned to the location with diving equipment. The water at 30 feet was murky, visibility limited to perhaps 10 feet, even with underwater lights. Marcus descended slowly, following his dive computer and compass to reach the coordinates where the sonar had detected the object. And then, emerging from the murk, he saw it. A pickup truck, an old Ford F-150, sitting upright on the lake bottom, as if someone had simply parked it there and walked away. Except this truck had been underwater for decades. Heavy corrosion covered every surface. Algae and sediment coated the body. The tires had long since deteriorated. The windows were intact, but so covered in mineral deposits and algae that seeing inside was nearly impossible. The truck bed was partially filled with sediment that had accumulated over years. Marcus carefully approached the vehicle, taking photographs and video. He examined the front end, looking for a license plate. There was one, though decades of submersion had corroded it badly. But even through the corrosion, Marcus could make out partial numbers and letters, enough to potentially identify the vehicle. He surfaced and immediately contacted the Potter County Sheriff's Department. By that afternoon, sheriff's deputies had arrived at the lake. By evening, a specialized underwater recovery team had been assembled. Over the next 3 days, divers would carefully prepare the vehicle for recovery, attaching cables and flotation devices, while a heavy-duty crane was positioned on shore. On May 23, 2023, the Ford F-150 was lifted from Lake Meredith. Water poured from every opening as the truck rose from depths where it had rested for decades. Once on shore, investigators could examine it properly. Despite extensive corrosion, the vehicle was identifiable. ABEE 1983 Ford F-150 pickup truck. Light blue paint barely visible beneath rust and sediment. The license plate, though corroded, was photographed and enhanced. Comparison with Texas motor vehicle records from the 1980s identified the registration. The truck had been registered to Daniel Robert Brown of rural Potter County, reported missing on October 15, 1983. Inside the truck cab, divers had already reported seeing what appeared to be human remains. Skeletal remains in the driver's seat, held in position by the metal components of a seatbelt. The fabric had deteriorated over 4 decades underwater, but the buckle and metal hardware had remained functional. Once the vehicle was on shore, forensic teams carefully documented and removed the remains. Along with the skeletal remains were several items that had survived submersion better than fabric or leather. A belt buckle, made of metal, heavily corroded but intact. A wedding ring, gold, tarnished but recognizable. The deteriorated remains of a wallet, the leather almost entirely decayed, but containing what appeared to be a driver's license in a laminated holder. The lamination had provided minimal protection over 40 years. The document was severely faded, water-damaged, and barely legible. Forensic examination with specialized imaging techniques revealed partial text that appeared to match the name Daniel Brown, though this alone would not be sufficient for positive identification. Forensic examination would take weeks, but the preliminary identification was clear. After 40 years, Daniel Robert Brown had been found. Not on a highway where searchers had looked. Not in a remote area where investigators had speculated he might have gone, but 30 feet underwater in Lake Meredith, in a location no one had thought to search thoroughly in 1983. Before we continue with this mystery, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell. What happened on October 15, 1983, involves a routine trip that went terribly wrong, a family left without answers for 40 years, and a discovery that finally brought closure. By the end, you will understand how an experienced rancher ended up at the bottom of a lake and why it took 4 decades to find him. The questions investigators faced were sobering. How did Daniel's truck end up in the lake? Was it an accident? And why had extensive searches in PBD 1983 failed to locate a vehicle that was, in hindsight, relatively close to the route he'd been traveling? Daniel Robert Brown was 37 years old in October 1983, a third-generation Texas rancher at a point in his life where experience met maturity. He stood 6 feet 1 inch tall, with a lean, weathered build that came from decades of physical ranch work. His hair was brown, starting to show gray at the temples. His hands were calloused from daily labor. Those who knew him described him as steady, reliable. The kind of man who showed up when he said he would and finished what he started. Daniel had been born in May 1946 in Amarillo, Texas, the son of Robert Brown, who'd been ranching in the Texas Panhandle since the 1930s. Daniel's grandfather had homesteaded in the region in 1908, building a small cattle operation that Robert had expanded over the decades. By the time Daniel was born, the Brown ranch encompassed approximately 800 acres of grazing land, a modest but viable operation in an area where successful ranching required understanding both cattle and the harsh West Texas environment. Daniel grew up on the ranch, learning to work cattle, maintain fences, operate equipment, and manage the countless tasks required to run an agricultural operation. He attended Amarillo High School, graduating in 1964. He'd briefly considered attending Texas Tech University in Lubbock to study agriculture, but the ranch needed him, and his father's health was declining. At 18, Daniel made the decision to stay and work the family operation full-time. In 1967, at age 21, Daniel married Sarah Mitchell, a young woman from a neighboring ranch family. Their courtship had been typical of rural Texas, meetings at church, county fairs, community gatherings. Their marriage was solid, built on shared values and understanding of ranch life. They had 2 children, a son, Robert, born in 1969, and a daughter, Amanda, born in 1972. When Daniel's father died in 1975, at age 68, Daniel inherited the ranch. At 29, he became the sole operator of the family business. The 1970s and early 80s were challenging times for cattle ranchers. Market prices fluctuated. Feed costs rose. Drought periodically plagued the region. But Daniel managed the operation carefully, making conservative decisions, avoiding debt when possible, slowly improving the herd quality. By 1983, Daniel had been ranching independently for 8 years. The Brown Ranch was stable, if not prosperous. His son Robert, now 14, was beginning to take on more responsibilities on the ranch. His daughter Amanda, 11, helped with lighter tasks. Sarah managed the household and handled much of the ranch's paperwork and bookkeeping. It was the life Daniel had grown up in and had chosen to continue. Daniel was known in the community as reliable and honest. He served on the local school board. He was active in his church. He was the kind of neighbor who'd help fix a fence or lend equipment without expecting anything in return. He rarely drank, didn't gamble, lived modestly despite owning hundreds of acres. He drove a 1983 Ford F-150 pickup truck, light blue, which he'd purchased new earlier that year. It was a practical vehicle for ranch work, reliable, capable of hauling, appropriate for rough rural roads. His routine was predictable. He worked the ranch daily, feeding cattle, checking fences, maintaining equipment. On Saturdays, he'd often drive into Amarillo for supplies or to attend cattle auctions when he was buying or selling stock. He'd been making the drive from his ranch to various locations in the region for nearly 20 years. He knew the roads intimately, was an experienced driver, and had never had a serious accident. October 15, 1983, was supposed to be a routine day, a Saturday. Daniel planned to drive to a cattle auction in Dumas, a town approximately 40 miles north of his ranch. He had several head of cattle he was considering selling if the prices were right. Though the cattle weren't with him that day, he was going to assess the market before deciding whether to bring animals to a future auction. The drive to Dumas was one Daniel had made dozens of times. The route followed State Highway 287 north from near his ranch, passing through sparsely populated rangeland, past a few small communities, eventually reaching Dumas. The highway ran relatively close to Lake Meredith in several places, though most of the lake wasn't visible from the road due to the terrain. In 1983, parts of the route near the lake had minimal safety infrastructure. No guardrails in some areas, especially where the road ran along ridges or past drop-offs that led toward the lake. On the morning of October 15th, Daniel woke at his usual time, around 5:30 a.m. He had breakfast with his family, coffee and eggs. He told Sarah he'd be back by early afternoon, that the auction started at 9 a.m., and he didn't expect to stay long. He was dressed in his typical work clothes: jeans, a long-sleeved shirt, boots, and a cap. He carried his wallet containing his driver's license, some cash, credit cards. He wore his wedding ring. His belt had a distinctive silver buckle he'd won at a roping competition years earlier. At approximately 7 a.m., Daniel kissed Sarah goodbye, said goodbye to his children, and climbed into his Ford F-150. The truck was in good condition, had a full tank of gas. The morning was cool but clear. Good weather for the drive. Sarah watched him drive down the ranch's long driveway toward the highway. It was a sight she'd seen thousands of times over 16 years of marriage. Daniel pulled onto the highway and drove north. That was the last time anyone who knew him saw Daniel Brown alive. Somewhere in the next 2 hours, during what should have been a routine 40-mile drive, something went catastrophically wrong. And for 40 years, no one would know what happened. October 15, 1983. A Saturday morning in the Texas Panhandle. The weather that day was recorded by the National Weather Service in Amarillo. Clear skies, temperature at 7 a.m. approximately 52 degrees. Fahrenheit, light winds from the south. Visibility was excellent. Road conditions on State Highway 287 were reported as good. The pavement dry. By all accounts, it was an ideal morning for driving. Daniel Brown left his ranch at approximately 7 a.m. The cattle auction in Dumas was scheduled to begin at 9 a.m. The drive should have taken about an hour, perhaps slightly longer, given that Daniel would have been driving at rural highway speeds, likely around 55 miles per hour on that route. Even accounting for slower speeds, Daniel should have arrived in Dumas by 8:30 a.m. at the latest. The auction facility in Dumas was operated by Panhandle Livestock, a business that held regular Saturday auctions. These auctions were social events as much as business transactions, places where ranchers gathered to buy and sell cattle, discuss markets, share information. People who attended regularly knew each other, recognized familiar faces. By 9 a.m., when the auction began, Daniel hadn't arrived. This wasn't immediately concerning. Ranchers sometimes ran late, delayed by last-minute ranch issues or vehicle problems. But by 9:30 a.m., then 10 a.m., Daniel still hadn't appeared. Several ranchers who knew Daniel were present. They found it unusual. Daniel was normally punctual, but assumed he'd decided not to come, or had been delayed by something on his ranch. Back at the Brown Ranch, Sarah wasn't expecting to hear from Daniel until he returned home. In 1983, cell phones didn't exist for general public use. Communication from the road meant finding a payphone, and there was no reason Daniel would need to call. Sarah spent the morning on typical Saturday tasks: housework, helping the children with chores, preparing lunch. By noon, Sarah began to wonder when Daniel would return. He'd said early afternoon, but noon was getting late if he'd planned to be back by then. Still, auctions sometimes ran long. Or Daniel might have stopped to talk with other ranchers. By 1 p.m., Sarah's wondering turned to mild concern. By 2 p.m., the concern deepened. At approximately 2:30 p.m., Sarah called the auction facility in Dumas. She asked if Daniel Brown had been there that morning. The person who answered checked and reported that no one remembered seeing Daniel, and his name wasn't on the sign-in sheet they kept for participants. As far as they knew, he hadn't attended the auction. Sarah's concern immediately escalated to fear. If Daniel hadn't made it to the auction, where was he? She called several neighboring ranchers, asking if anyone had seen Daniel that morning. No one had. She called her brother, who lived in Amarillo, asking him to check hospitals in case Daniel had been in an accident. No one named Daniel Brown had been admitted. By 3 p.m., Sarah called the Potter County Sheriff's Department to report her husband missing. The deputy who took the call asked standard questions. How long had he been gone? Where was he supposed to go? What was he driving? Had there been any arguments or problems? Sarah explained that Daniel had left at 7 a.m., should have been in Dumas by 9 a.m., but had never arrived. He was driving a light blue 1983 Ford F-150 with Texas license plates. There had been no arguments, no problems, no reason for him not to go where he'd said he was going. The Sheriff's Department immediately began standard procedures for a missing person case. Deputies contacted the Texas Highway Patrol, requesting that officers watch for Daniel's truck along Highway 287 and other routes between the Brown Ranch and Dumas. By 4 p.m., multiple law enforcement units were actively searching. Highway patrol officers drove the most direct route from the Brown Ranch area to Dumas, looking for any sign of Daniel's truck. They checked for signs of accidents, skid marks, disturbed earth, damaged vegetation, anything indicating a vehicle had left. The road. They found nothing. The highway was clear, no evidence of any incidents. As evening approached and Daniel still hadn't been found, the search expanded. Volunteers from the community began arriving at the Brown Ranch, organizing to search back roads and rural areas. By dark, approximately 50 people were involved in the search effort. They drove rural roads with spotlights, checked ranch properties, looked in areas where a vehicle might have pulled off the road due to mechanical problems. Sunday, October 16th, the search intensified. The Potter County Sheriff's Department coordinated with multiple agencies. Volunteer search parties combed the area. Small aircraft flew over the route and surrounding areas, looking for any sign of a light blue truck. Nothing. By Monday, October 17th, the investigation had become a major effort. Sheriff Thomas Clark held a press conference, asking anyone who might have seen Daniel or his truck on Saturday morning to contact authorities. Local television stations in Amarillo ran the story. Newspapers published Daniel's description and details about his truck. The investigation into Daniel Brown's disappearance quickly became one of the most puzzling missing persons cases Potter County had seen. Sheriff Clark assigned his best investigators to the case and brought in Texas Rangers to assist. Every aspect of Daniel's life was examined for clues to his disappearance. Investigators interviewed Sarah extensively. They verified that the marriage was stable, that there had been no arguments on the morning of October 15th, no reason Daniel might voluntarily disappear. Financial records were examined. The ranch was modestly successful. No significant debts. No financial crisis that might cause stress. Daniel's bank accounts showed normal activity. No large withdrawals. Nothing unusual. Investigators looked into Daniel's personal relationships. Did he have enemies? Conflicts with neighbors? Business disputes? They found nothing. Daniel was well-liked, had good relationships with neighbors and other ranchers. He had no known enemies, no one who might want to harm him. His business dealings were straightforward and honest. The investigation examined several theories. Mechanical breakdown. Perhaps Daniel's truck had broken down in a remote area. But the truck was new, well-maintained. And even if it had broken down, Daniel would have walked to find help or been found by passing motorists. The highway wasn't deserted. Traffic passed regularly. Medical emergency. Perhaps Daniel had suffered a heart attack or stroke while driving. But if this had caused an accident, where was the evidence? No accident scene had been found along the route, and Daniel had been in good health. No history of heart problems or other serious medical conditions. He'd had a physical examination earlier in 1983 for life insurance purposes and had been cleared as healthy. Foul play. Perhaps Daniel had been the victim of a crime. But robbery didn't make sense. Daniel carried minimal cash, and his truck, while new, wasn't particularly valuable. Kidnapping seemed unlikely given the lack of ransom demands. Murder would require a motive, and investigators couldn't identify anyone with motive to harm Daniel. Voluntary disappearance. Perhaps Daniel had chosen to leave his family and start over somewhere else. But this seemed completely out of character. Daniel was devoted to his family, his ranch, his community. He had no apparent reason to disappear voluntarily. And if he had left intentionally, why had his truck never been found? Why had no one seen him since October 15th? The most extensive searching focused on the route Daniel would have taken. Highway 287 was searched repeatedly. Side roads were checked. Rural properties along the route were examined with owner's permission. Abandoned buildings, old homesteads, anywhere a vehicle might be hidden or a person might take shelter were investigated. Lake Meredith was considered during the investigation but not searched extensively. The reasoning was logical. The highway didn't run immediately adjacent to the lake for most of its length. While the road passed within a few miles of the lake in several places, the terrain between the road and water was rugged. There were no obvious places where a vehicle could accidentally drive into the lake from the highway. Most access to the lake was via designated roads and boat ramps, not from the main highway. Investigators did check the boat ramps and access areas around Lake Meredith, looking for any sign that Daniel might have driven to the lake for some reason. They found nothing. The idea that his truck might be in the lake was considered, but seemed unlikely given the distance from the highway and lack of evidence that he'd ever reached the lake area. As weeks became months, the investigation continued, but with diminishing returns. Every lead had been followed. Every reasonable location had been searched. Daniel Brown and his Ford F-150 had simply vanished. In 1984, 1 year after his disappearance, the investigation was still technically active, but had no new leads. The case remained open, but investigators had exhausted their options with 1980s technology and resources. Sarah Brown and her children faced the terrible limbo of not knowing what had happened to their husband and father. In 1988, 5 years after Daniel's disappearance, Sarah petitioned the court to have Daniel declared legally dead. This was necessary to settle his estate, to allow the family to move forward financially. The court granted the petition. Daniel Robert Brown was declared legally deceased, though no body had been found, no cause of death established, no explanation provided. Sarah continued operating the ranch with her son Robert's help. In 1990, Robert took over primary management of the operation. Sarah never remarried, never stopped wondering what had happened to Daniel. Their daughter Amanda moved away from the area after high school, though she visited regularly. The decades passed. The 1990s came and went. The 2000s arrived with new technology: GPS, cell phones, internet. But none of these advances helped solve the mystery of what happened to Daniel Brown on October 15, 1983. The case became one of those unsolved mysteries that families never forget, but others gradually do. Occasionally, when someone brought up old unsolved cases in Potter County, Daniel Brown's disappearance would be mentioned, but with no new evidence, no witnesses coming forward, no body ever found. The case seemed destined to remain forever unsolved. And all that time, 30 feet underwater in Lake Meredith, in a location that was perhaps 2 miles from the highway but had never been searched thoroughly, Daniel Brown's Ford F-150 sat on the lake bottom, holding the answer to a 40-year-old mystery. The 40 years between Daniel Brown's disappearance in 1983 and the discovery of his remains in 2023 saw dramatic changes in the world, in technology, and in the lives of his family. Sarah Brown passed away in 2016, at age 70, having lived 33 years, never knowing what happened to her husband. She died believing Daniel had somehow suffered an accident or medical emergency in a location that had simply never been found, or possibly had been the victim of foul play whose perpetrators had concealed the crime too well. Robert Brown, Daniel's son, continued operating the family ranch. By 2023, he was 54 years old, had children and grandchildren of his own. He'd grown up with the mystery of his father's disappearance as a defining element of his childhood and young adulthood. For Robert, his last memory of his father was being 14 years old, saying goodbye on a Saturday morning, never seeing him again. Amanda Brown, Daniel's daughter, had married, changed her name to Amanda Davis, and lived in Austin, Texas, working as a teacher. She was 51 in 2023. She'd been 11 when her father disappeared, young enough that her memories of him were filtered through a child's perspective, but old enough that the loss had shaped her entire life. Both Robert and Amanda had periodically searched for information about their father over the years. In the 1990s, when internet databases of missing persons began to appear, they'd checked them, hoping some new information might surface. In the 2000s, they'd submitted DNA samples to databases that might match unidentified remains. They'd never found anything that brought them closer to answers. The mystery of Daniel Brown's disappearance had various theories over the decades. Some people in the community believed Daniel had suffered a medical emergency while driving and had somehow ended up in a location so remote that his body and truck had never been found. Others thought foul play was involved, though no one could explain who or why. A few people thought Daniel might have voluntarily disappeared, though those who knew him rejected this theory as completely inconsistent with his character. Lake Meredith, where Daniel's truck actually rested, underwent changes over the 40 years. The lake's water levels fluctuated based on rainfall, drought, and water usage by the region. In wet years, the lake would be full, its shoreline reaching to the historical high water mark. In drought years, water levels would drop significantly, revealing shoreline and lake bottom that had been submerged for years. The area where Daniel's truck had entered the water in October 1983 was approximately 30 feet deep under normal lake levels. The location was in the western section of the lake, in an area where the old Canadian River channel ran before the dam created the reservoir. It wasn't near any boat ramps or popular fishing spots. Recreational boaters rarely went to that specific area because it offered nothing special compared to more accessible parts of the lake. In the 1980s and 90s, underwater search technology was limited and expensive. Sonar equipment existed, but wasn't widely available for civilian use. If investigators in 1983 had specifically decided to search the lake thoroughly, it would have required significant resources and equipment that weren't readily accessible to a rural Texas sheriff's department. And without specific reason to believe Daniel's truck was in the lake, such an extensive search wouldn't have been justified. By the 2000s and 2010s, underwater search technology had advanced significantly. Side-scan sonar became more sophisticated, more affordable, more widely available. Recreational diving equipment improved. GPS allowed precise mapping and location recording. These technologies were used to search other lakes for missing persons and vehicles, sometimes with success. But Lake Meredith wasn't searched with these new technologies in connection with Daniel Brown's case. The investigation had been closed for decades. The family had no reason to specifically request a search of the lake, and law enforcement agencies, with limited resources, focus on active cases rather than cold cases without new leads. In 2020 and 2021, a severe drought began affecting the Texas Panhandle. Lake Meredith's water levels dropped to historic lows. By 2023, the lake was at approximately 60% of capacity. Areas that had been underwater for decades were exposed. The drought was devastating for the region's agriculture and water supply, but it created an unexpected opportunity for underwater mapping. Southwest Aquatic Research, contracted to map the lake bottom, was using advanced side-scan sonar equipment that created detailed images of underwater topography and objects. This technology could distinguish between natural features and man-made objects, could identify shapes and sizes with considerable accuracy. May 19, 2023. Marcus Webb and his team from Southwest Aquatic Research were methodically mapping the western section of Lake Meredith. The area they were surveying on that day was remote, far from boat ramps, in a section where the Prand, old river channel, created depths of 30 to 40 feet, even with the drought-reduced water levels. The side-scan sonar displayed on Marcus's equipment screen showed the lake bottom clearly. Sediment, rocks, occasional submerged trees that had been in the river valley before the dam created the lake. And then, at approximately 2 p.m., the sonar detected something anomalous. At a depth of 28 feet, the equipment showed a large rectangular object with clear geometric lines. The size was approximately 15 to 18 feet long, 6 to 7 feet wide. The shape and dimensions matched a vehicle. Marcus marked the location with GPS coordinates and continued his survey. But the object occupied his thoughts. After 40 years of doing underwater surveys, Marcus had encountered submerged vehicles before. Sometimes they were stolen vehicles that had been deliberately dumped. Sometimes they were boats that had sunk. Occasionally they were vehicles that had accidentally entered the water, sometimes with tragic results. That evening, reviewing the sonar images, Marcus decided the object warranted investigation. On May 20th, he returned to the location with diving equipment and an assistant, Jennifer Hayes. The water clarity at 28 feet wasn't good. Even with powerful underwater lights, visibility was limited to about 8 feet. But it was enough. Marcus descended to the lake bottom following his dive computer. The sediment at that depth was soft, accumulated, silt from 40 years of the lake's existence. And there, partially embedded in that sediment, sitting upright, was a pickup truck. Even underwater, heavily corroded, covered in algae and mineral deposits, the vehicle was identifiable as a Ford F-150 from the early 1980s. The distinctive body style, the size, the shape of the cab and bed. The truck faced north, suggesting it had entered the water from the south side of the lake, possibly from an area where the shore used to be, closer to the highway before the lake was created. Marcus photographed the vehicle extensively. The windows were intact, but so coated with deposits that seeing inside was impossible without cleaning them, which Marcus didn't do. This was potentially a law enforcement matter. The doors were closed. The truck bed was partially filled with sediment. The tires had deteriorated to the point where only the steel belts remained. At the front of the vehicle, Marcus found a license plate. 40 years of submersion had corroded it severely, but it was still attached. He photographed it carefully. Despite the corrosion, some letters and numbers were partially legible. Marcus surfaced and immediately contacted the Potter County Sheriff's Department. He explained what he'd found: a submerged vehicle, likely from the early 1980s, with a partially legible license plate, at coordinates he provided. By that afternoon, sheriff's deputies had responded. Sheriff David Martinez, who'd been in office since 2015 and wasn't personally familiar with the 1983 Daniel Brown case, ordered an investigation. Divers from the sheriff's department went down to examine the vehicle and reported that there appeared to be human skeletal remains inside the cab. Over the next 2 days, a recovery operation was planned and executed. This involved specialized equipment: a crane positioned on the shore, cable and flotation systems prepared by professional recovery divers, coordination with state environmental authorities to ensure the recovery didn't violate lake regulations. On May 23, 2023, the recovery began. Divers attached heavy cables to the truck's frame and axles. Flotation bags were attached to help control the ascent. Slowly, carefully, the crane lifted. The truck, which weighed approximately 4,000 pounds, when new but now weighed significantly more due to water absorption and accumulated sediment, gradually rose. When the truck broke the surface, water poured from every opening. The vehicle was unrecognizable from its original appearance, heavily corroded, but still structurally intact. Once on shore, investigators could examine it properly. The exterior showed damage consistent with 40 years of submersion. The paint was almost entirely gone, replaced by heavy rust. The chrome fixtures had corroded. The glass was intact, but heavily etched by minerals. The tires were destroyed. But the vehicle, identification number, stamped on the frame and other locations, was still readable after cleaning. The VIN identified the truck as a 1983 Ford F-150, manufactured in January 1983. Texas motor vehicle records were searched. The VIN matched a truck registered to Daniel Robert Brown of rural Potter County, reported missing in October 1983. Inside the cab, investigators found skeletal remains secured by a seatbelt. The fabric of the seatbelt had partially deteriorated, but the metal buckle and mechanism had held. The remains were in the driver's seat, positioned as if the person had been driving when the truck entered the water. The body appeared to have stayed in the vehicle rather than exiting, suggesting the person either couldn't exit or was unconscious or deceased when the vehicle submerged. Personal effects recovered with the remains included several items that had survived submersion better than fabric or paper. A belt buckle, made of silver, heavily tarnished but still bearing the distinctive design of a roping competition buckle. A wedding ring, gold, on one of the finger bones. The corroded remains of a wallet, the leather almost entirely decayed, but containing what appeared to be a driver's license in a laminated holder. After 40 years underwater, the document was severely degraded. Forensic imaging specialists used enhancement techniques to extract what information they could. Partial text was visible that appeared consistent with the name Daniel Brown, and fragments of a photograph suggested a man of appropriate age, though the image quality was too poor for facial recognition. This evidence, while supportive, would require confirmation through more reliable identification methods. The forensic examination would take weeks. The skeletal remains were transported to the Texas State Medical Examiner's office in Austin. Forensic anthropologists examined them to determine age, sex, height, and any evidence of injury or cause of death. The results indicated an adult male, approximately 35 to 40 years old at time of death based on bone development and wear. Height estimated at approximately 6 feet 1 inch. No signs of trauma that would indicate foul play. No fractures, no bullet holes, no evidence of stabbing or blunt force injury. The absence of trauma didn't rule out foul play entirely, but it made accident or natural causes more likely. Dental records from the 1980s were located. Daniel Brown's dental records had been maintained by an Amarillo dentist who'd since retired, but the records had been archived. Comparison with the skeletal remains provided a probable match based on several distinctive features. For definitive identification, DNA analysis was conducted. Robert Brown and Amanda Davis, Daniel's children, were contacted and agreed to provide DNA samples. Comparison between genetic material from the skeletal remains and the samples from Robert and Amanda provided conclusive identification. The remains were those of Daniel Robert Brown, missing for 40 years. The discovery of Daniel Brown's remains and his Ford F-150 40 years after his disappearance answered the question of where he'd been, but raised others about how and why. After 4 decades underwater, forensic evidence was limited in what it could reveal about the circumstances of his death. What investigators could determine with reasonable certainty. Daniel Brown died in October 1983, almost certainly on October 15th, the day he disappeared. The skeletal remains showed no evidence of living for an extended period after that date. He'd been in his truck when it entered Lake Meredith and had remained in the vehicle after it submerged. The cause of death, after 40 years, was impossible to determine definitively. Drowning leaves no skeletal evidence. The medical examiner's report listed the cause of death as undetermined, though drowning following vehicular accident was noted as the most probable cause based on circumstances. The location where the truck was found provided clues to what likely happened. Investigators examined historical maps and aerial photographs from 1983. They found something significant. In October 1983, the section of shoreline where Daniel's truck appeared to have entered the water was considerably closer to State Highway 287 than it was in DG Inter 2023. In 1983, Lake Meredith's water levels were higher than in 2023 due to the recent drought. The shoreline in the area where Daniel's truck was found would have been approximately 1 mile from the highway. Between the highway and the water was rugged terrain with some dirt roads and tracks used by ranchers and recreational visitors to the lake. Investigators developed a theory of what most likely happened, acknowledging that after 40 years, certainty was impossible. On the morning of October 15, 1983, Daniel left his ranch heading north on Highway 287 toward Dumas. At some point during the drive, something caused him to leave the highway. Possible reasons included a medical emergency. Perhaps Daniel suffered a heart attack, stroke, or other sudden medical event that impaired his driving. In attempting to pull off the highway, he might have turned onto a side road or track that led toward the lake, swerving to avoid an obstacle. Perhaps an animal crossed the highway, or another vehicle made an unexpected movement. Daniel might have swerved and, in doing so, left the paved highway and ended up on a side route. Mechanical issue. Perhaps a tire blowout or steering problem caused the truck to leave the highway. Though the truck was new and well-maintained, mechanical failures can happen without warning. Simple navigation error. The area where Daniel's truck was found was remote, with several dirt roads and tracks leading off the main highway. Perhaps Daniel turned onto one of these, thinking it was a shortcut or alternate route, and became disoriented. Once off the main highway, following one of the side roads or tracks that existed in that area, Daniel would have found himself in rugged terrain heading toward the lake. The area in 1983 had minimal development, no guardrails, no signs warning of water ahead. In clear daylight, a driver would see the lake ahead and stop. But if visibility was limited, if dust was blowing, if the sun was at a bad angle, or if the driver was impaired by a medical emergency, it would be possible to drive toward the lake without realizing the danger until too late. The truck's final position suggested it had entered the water at moderate speed, perhaps 15 to 25 miles per hour. Fast enough to drive into water that deepened quickly, but not fast enough to suggest high-speed loss of control. The truck went into the water, likely in an area where the bottom dropped off steeply as it followed the old river channel. The vehicle would have floated briefly. Pickup trucks float for a short time due to trapped air, then begun sinking as water entered the cab and bed. If Daniel was conscious when the truck entered the water, he would have had a brief opportunity to escape. But opening the door of a sinking vehicle is extremely difficult due to water pressure. The driver's side window, if Daniel tried to open it or break it, was his best escape route. But if he was already unconscious from a medical emergency, or if he panicked and couldn't get the window open, he would have gone down with the truck. The truck sank to the bottom, approximately 30 feet down, and settled in the sediment. Daniel's body, secured by the seatbelt, remained in the driver's seat. Over the following 40 years, the soft tissues decomposed, the fabric and leather deteriorated, but the metal components, the truck's frame, the belt buckle, the wedding ring, survived. The truck itself survived, corroded but structurally intact, becoming part of the lake bottom, gradually covered by sediment. Why was the truck never found during the 1983 investigation? Several factors contributed. The location was approximately 1 mile from the main highway. Search efforts focused on the highway itself and immediately adjacent areas, not on terrain a mile away. There were no witnesses who reported seeing a vehicle leave the highway or drive toward the lake in that area on October 15th. The specific area where the truck entered the water wasn't near any boat ramps, campgrounds, or recreational areas where people regularly visited. It was simply empty shoreline in a remote section of a large lake. The technology to thoroughly search a lake in 1983 was limited and expensive. Without specific reason to believe Daniel's truck was in that particular section of the lake, deploying such technology wouldn't have been justified. The truck sank to 30 feet, too deep for casual observation from the shore or from boats passing overhead. Even if someone had been in the area, they wouldn't have seen the submerged vehicle unless they were specifically looking for it with appropriate equipment. The discovery in 2023 came about through a combination of factors: advanced technology that didn't exist in 1983, a drought that lowered water levels, making the search area more accessible, and a systematic survey that covered areas not previously examined thoroughly. Robert Brown and Amanda Davis received the news of their father's discovery with complicated emotions. Relief that they finally knew what happened. Grief reopened by confirmation that their father had died on the day he disappeared. Some closure in knowing he hadn't suffered a prolonged ordeal or been the victim of foul play, but rather died quickly in what appeared to be a tragic accident. Frustration that the answer had been so close for 40 years, but technology and circumstances hadn't aligned to find it sooner. In June 2023, Daniel Robert Brown's remains were released to his family. On June 24th, he was buried in a cemetery in Amarillo, next to Sarah, who died in 2016. The gravestone acknowledged his life and the mystery that had finally been solved. Daniel Robert Brown, 1946–1983, lost for 40 years, finally home. So, what really happened to Daniel Brown? Based on available evidence and the most logical interpretation, Daniel likely left the highway on October 15, 1983, either due to a medical emergency, mechanical issue, or navigation error. He ended up on a side route that led toward Lake Meredith. Unable to stop in time or unaware of the danger ahead, his truck entered the water in a remote area. The truck sank quickly to 30 feet. Daniel, whether conscious or not, died in the IDE vehicle, which settled on the lake bottom where it remained for 40 years until technology and drought-lowered water levels finally revealed it. It wasn't murder. It wasn't a complicated mystery. It was a tragic accident in a remote location, undiscovered because the exact spot where it happened was just far enough from the highway, just remote enough, just deep enough that 40 years passed before anyone happened to look in exactly the right place. The story of Daniel Brown reminds us that sometimes the missing are closer than we imagine, hidden not by intent, but by circumstance and geography. That technology eventually catches up to mysteries that older methods couldn't solve. That closure, even after 40 years, still matters to families left behind, and that in remote areas like the Texas Panhandle, the landscape itself can keep secrets for decades, waiting for the right moment and the right tools to finally reveal the truth.